If you're a movie collector, you need Movies Anywhere. It pulls your favorite purchase movies from participating digital retailers into one central place, so you can finally say goodbye to scattered movie collections and hello to an organized library. With Movies Anywhere, you can watch your favorite movies on any compatible device, whenever and wherever you want. Ready to grow and enjoy your digital collection? Visit moviesanywhere.com/welcome and register for free. Registration with Movies Anywhere required. Open to U.S. residents 13 and over.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.
Hey everyone, this is the Almost World Podcast. Bringing to you mind-blowing interviews with guests from all over the world. So settle down, relax, and enjoy the show. Oh yeah, by the way, if you like the podcast, please support Elmo's World Podcast on Patreon. Your support is what helps the podcast improve more and more. Welcome to Elmo's World Podcast. This is Elmo and with my awesome friend, Cale. Hey man, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi Elmo. I'm Cale. I am an atheist. I haven't always been an atheist, but I do call myself an atheist now. I live in Indiana. There's not really a whole lot that's interesting about me, I would say personally. I'm a pretty unremarkable guy. So there you go.
Okay, I think that when it comes to the worldviews that people have, there are so many factors and variables that come into play, and decide that. And I think that you would have a lot to say, and maybe you could tell us like your a background, maybe even your life story on how you've become you decided to be an atheist. I'm really curious, man. Like maybe when you were a child, were you raised an atheist or a Christian or what?
Yeah, I was actually raised an atheist. Yeah. And I think it's a good point that you make, right? There really are a lot of factors that go into worldview. And I think sometimes we like to imagine ourselves as these perfectly rational machines that take in objective data about the world and always come to a sort of like the best possible belief, and I don't think that's true. It's certainly not true for me. I was raised an atheist. My parents weren't very strong about it. I never heard my parents say anything negative or disparaging about any religion. In fact, the opposite. They really made an effort to introduce me to like a wide range of world religions and mythologies. They sent me to church. They sent me to synagogue. So I definitely had exposure. But they just never told me that this stuff was true. That was not what they thought. And so they didn't tell me. And so I didn't grow up that way. And so for my whole life, I've just never thought that any of these religions were true, largely because of how I was raised. And that probably would have continued more or less unreflectively perhaps, until now, except that several years ago, I couldn't even tell you when, maybe 8 years ago now, a friend of mine was getting married, and he had been an atheist all his life as well, and his wife was Catholic. And this was a point of tension, not like a deal breaker, but a point of tension between them. And he was interested in whether, it was reasonable for him to convert to Catholicism. He's like, is there something to this? Is it a thing that people can go out and reasonably believe, reasonably arrive at by examining evidence? And he got into some popular Christian apologetics, and he asked me at one point what my opinion of these popular Christian apologists was, and that really led me down a weird rabbit hole. I don't know. I don't know how like your experience with popular apologetics has been, but for me, it is a bizarre world that I had no knowledge of before this, and then got really sucked into. It's fascinating and strange. And I read a bunch of apologists, both modern and historical. And, you know, I wanted to know. I thought it was a reasonable question that my friend had posed to me. Like, can you find good sort of intellectual reasons to affirm Christianity? And I figured, frankly, that you probably could. That if I read through this stuff, I would probably find that this huge amount of intellectual and philosophical work that's been done by theologians and apologists throughout history would accumulate into sort of a reasonable justification for converting to Christianity. And I didn't find that. I found that I really was disappointed, pretty badly disappointed, by my delve into Christian apologetics. What I found was just really consistently weak reasoning, sort of a poor grasp of reasoning from evidence, a lot of just kind of haphazard metaphysical speculation taken, to use the pun intentionally, as gospel, and then extrapolated from, often in very wild ways, to reach a conclusion that was clearly aimed at, right? Not arrived at organically. And this was really consistent. And the more I looked at Christian apologetics, the more convinced I became that Christianity and theism more broadly really wasn't a reasonable thing to believe, that people really didn't have good sort of intellectual justifications for affirming it. And so I, over the course of this project and interacting with the work, I really went from a position of being sort of an agnostic, thinking, you know, well, I don't have a good reason to believe, but maybe somebody does, to being a pretty hard atheist. Like I am confident now that theism is false, and I'm reasonably confident that nobody really has a good epistemic justification for affirming it. And that's kind of where I'm at now, in terms of my stance on that.
Yeah, it's pretty understandable, man. Yeah, I guess, you know, when it comes to like analyzing apologetics, you know, Christian or any other religious claims, there are so many things that the roads that one has to take to fully like understand every one of them, right? So during your you know, your quest for truth, I would call it, is what was your standard to say, you know, in a way, like what would have convinced you to be able to say that, oh, because of this, Christianity or theism is actually plausible, or something that could actually be metaphysically justified, or, you know, you could actually know it to be true? What would have convinced you?
It's a really good question, actually, and a big part of sort of what I took away from this has to do more with that than it does with theism, or atheism in particular. And when I started into this, my contributions to the discussion were pretty embarrassing. I didn't really have any good grasp of how to evaluate arguments, and I would just look at these arguments and see something that I kind of disagreed with, and then flounder around and scrounge up like, this is why this premise is false. This is why this premise is false. And that approach was not very satisfying for very long. And so what I became interested in is sort of exactly what you're asking about, right? Like, how would we evaluate whether or not we have a justification, whether or not like some argument or combination of arguments or a set of evidence provides a justification, an epistemic justification for affirming that theism is true. And in digging into that, I sort of started learning about probability theory, and specifically the sort of Coxian, or what probably is more often called Bayesian interpretation of probability theory, where probabilities map to epistemic credences, and you can sort of evaluate what epistemic credences should be given certain inputs and starting positions in little toy examples. I actually got into this reading a paper by Rathmanner and Hutter on Solomonoff induction. Solomonoff induction is sort of a probability-based or information theory-based theory of universal induction. It's actually super cool, and you should look into it sometime. And it came up as an alternative, or sort of a formulation of Occam's razor in a discussion. My brother knew more about it than I did, sent me this paper, and I read it, and I was really hooked then on this kind of information theoretic, probability theory based approach to epistemology. I went on from that to read a book by E.T. James called Probability Theory, The Logic of Science, which sort of lays out how this Coxian interpretation of probability theory sort of underpins essentially all of the classic scientific hypothesis testing methods and inference methods. And so that was, and then at that point I was sold. I actually went back to school as a result of this and studied statistics, and ended up really going into a very different career path as a result. So to get back to your question more specifically, I think that what I would want to see from an argument for theism or an argument for Christianity is I would want to be able to start at a pretty minimal and modest set of background assumptions, and either be shown deductively that these assumptions entail the truth of theism, or be shown essentially that given this set of background assumptions and some set of observations about the world, that theism is probably true, or would be probably true for some rational hypothetical inductor, starting with those background assumptions and being fed those observations. That's what I would like to see. And I think you could even say that an argument for theism is a good argument, though perhaps not a sufficient argument on its own, if it were capable of showing that a hypothetical inductor with some modest set of background assumptions would be more confident in theism after being fed some set of observations than it was before. That is essentially a fancy way of saying that if you could show me something that really was sort of good evidence for theism, that would be a good start, though not necessarily sufficient on its own.
In a way, what you're saying is that use theism to sort of demonstrate as to be demonstrable, and then I'll believe it, something like that, right? Because you're looking for some like background assumptions that are just modest and that can be shown deductively, and to entail theism, right?
Yeah, so that would be one good approach. You see sort of metaphysical arguments like first mover arguments, where they start with some sort of assumptions about how metaphysics is structured, about how causality is structured. And then if you accept all of these assumptions, then you sort of end up having to accept that there's some unmoved first mover, right? So there's that style of argument. And what I find generally is that these sets of metaphysical assumptions that they start with are pretty fraught. They're complex. They have a lot of moving parts in them, and you've got to accept sort of a bunch of different things before you're really forced into the conclusion. So that would be an example of maybe an immodest set of starting assumptions. And I would like to see an argument where you could reach the same conclusion, but with a much more pared down, like, you know, but without making so many hard assumptions about how metaphysics works. So that would be one approach. And then the other approach would be sort of an evidence-based approach. And when it comes to evidence-based approaches, you know, I want you to be able to show your work sort of in the language of probability theory, or at least I want to be able to take your work and convert it into the language of probability theory and show that it does actually produce a meaningful result.
Well, you know, when it comes to the metaphysical arguments for theism, right? You sort of criticized the Kalam, probably like the first mover and all that, all those theistic arguments, to have like a modest set of starting. As an immodest set of starting examples, the assumptions that they already make, like for example, that how observation of causality, right? And then it's pretty basic, like if this is an effect and has a cause, then that cause is an effect and has a cause, and so on. And so they basically like logically followed, while granting that causality is how the universe sort of, it's a law that the universe follows, right? So I don't know how that's immodest. I think it's pretty obvious, right? Do you think that there's something going on other than causality?
Yeah, so let's talk about causality. Do we actually directly observe causality? I ask rhetorically because I sort of generally take Hume's position that no, we don't. We infer causality from our observations. You know, I'm sitting here right now just fidgeting with like a twist tie, right? And I can observe myself thinking I'm going to bend this twist tie into a circle, and then my fingers move and they push on the twist tie and it ends up in a circle. And from that, we sort of infer this chain of causality, but the causality itself is not something we observe. It's an inference, a sort of mental model that we impose on the world. And I'm not saying that there is no real causality. I think that there is. What I'm saying is that we don't know a lot about it. If you think about Aristotle, right, Aristotle's notion of causality, and he sort of viewed things as having, this is going to be a butchering of Aristotle's metaphysics, which I haven't read in a really long time. But if you'll tolerate my inept summary here, he'd sort of look at an object and say, there are lots of sort of ways that this object could be. I'm looking at the twist tie, and it could be straight, or it could be a little curlicue, it could be a circle, I could tie it into a knot. And all of these potentialities sort of exist as potentials. And then I, as a sort of agent, cause one of these potentials to be actualized in the twist tie. And so that's a fine mental model. It's not silly, but neither is it like, do the potentials really exist? How do I actualize one of those potentials? It's not a very complete, robust, or sophisticated mental model. It's just a little story, and maybe it's useful, but then Aquinas is going to take some version of that story and say, like, yes, this is the fundamental truth about how reality works. And if we believe that that's the fundamental truth about how reality works, then, maybe like we end up believing in God. And for me, Aristotle did not pin down the fundamental truth about how reality works. He told himself a very simplistic story that elides a huge amount of detail. He knew nothing about electrostatic forces, subatomic particles, right? I can sit down and tell a much more elaborate and accurate story about causation regarding this twist tie than Aristotle ever could have. And like, I know nothing, I'm not a physicist. I'm like an idiot. So Aristotle wasn't right. He hadn't captured the fundamental nature of reality. And when we, look at an argument like Aquinas, where Aquinas basically starts by saying, yes, here in this simplistic story, we have captured the fundamental nature of reality. That's silly. That's an overburdened metaphysical assumption. That's an immodest metaphysical assumption. So yeah, I'm not going to buy Aristotle's or Aquinas's conclusion, and neither should anyone else. It's not a good argument, because taking this simplistic narrative description of causality as some grand fundamental truth is not reasonable.
Mm-hmm. You said two things here, right? Like, you said that if theistic arguments could provide like a modest set of background assumptions, on metaphysics and all of that, and prove it to be demonstrable, then, and the other one is that if theists could provide like a sort of evidence-based approach that show that they show their work in the language of probability theory. Okay, so those are the two set standards you set. So in a way, I could you are you saying that, okay, so when it comes to the kalam, I have my critique on it. Therefore, my critique shows that kalam is inconsistent and has a modest set of background assumptions. Therefore, I'm not gonna believe in God. Also, because they're not showing like a probability theory. Is that right?
Not exactly. I mean, I'm not suggesting that William Lane Craig like literally needs to sit down and rewrite the Kalam in the language of probability theory, but I do think the Kalam is a pretty good way of illustrating sort of why arguments end up being insufficient when maybe they might look like they're sufficient if you subject them to a more rigorous evaluative criteria.
Yeah, but my question was that, yeah, my question was that you set a standard for what can make you believe in God, right? And that standard was that, can theists provide me a modest set of background assumptions and prove it to be demonstrable? And also, and the other standard is that, could they like provide like an evidence-based approach using like the language of probability? So in a way, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but is the reason that you don't believe in God literally because there is no like modest, there is literally no like certain proof for God?
So that's part of it, right? I mean, you could, like you said, there's sort of a lot that goes into it. You might say that the causal reason, the basic causal story for why I don't believe in God is that I was raised that way. And then you might also say, okay, but you could have come to believe in God had you been presented a a good argument, and that's true. I could have been persuaded to believe in God by a good argument, but I haven't found one of those. And then also, sort of in the course of studying this, I've found arguments against believing in God, right? And I, I think that a lot of the arguments against theism sort of in the popular atheist culture are not very good ones, but some of them are better. And then I've constructed I have constructed an argument which I think epistemically justifies to my own standards rejecting theism, believing that theism is false. It's a little much to get into, especially without text. I can let me give you a rundown, right? So so the basic idea behind the argument is that I construct a pretty minimalistic set of criterion that your background assumptions, a set of criterion for background assumptions. And then I show that any set of background assumptions which meet those criterion yield a probability for theism, which is extremely low, like a posterior probability for theism that's extremely low. And the set of background assumptions is essentially that that we do not exclude a posteriori or a priori from consideration a class of sort of random reality actualizers. So I posit as an alternative explanation for the existence of a contingent reality, sort of a mindless, metaphysically necessary random reality actualizer, right? Which just has a certain number of contingent realities, a certain set of contingent realities that it's capable of actualizing, and then it has some characteristic probability distribution over these realities, and it picks one at random and actualizes it, right? And we can imagine infinitely many different random reality actualizers with different sets of realities they can actualize and different characteristic distributions over those sets of realities. And sort of if you accept that this sort of thing is not impossible, then you really must conclude that theism is almost certainly false. And this is just because theism is sort of one particular cosmogenic hypothesis in this infinite sea of alternative particular cosmogenic hypotheses, infinitely many of which, it should be noted, are better explanations for the universe as we see it than theism is. And yeah, so formalizing that, I'd really have to write it out for you. I don't think I could. I mean, even if I managed to like speak my way through it, it would be meaningless to almost every listener.
All right. Maybe we could sort of break it down, man. Like, I'm really curious. That's pretty interesting. I never heard this argument before, and I really love it. Okay, so yeah, basically what you're saying is that okay, the universe could have there is a like theism is a particular cosmogenic hypothesis, but you're saying like, look, there are infinitely other hypotheses that are better explanations for the universe as we know it, right? Can you tell me like how you've arrived at this conclusion?
Well, so imagine this imagine this very simple sort of toy example, right? Imagine a metaphysically necessary sort of mindless reality actualizer, and all it can do is it makes one choice from its characteristic distribution of contingent realities and actualizes whatever reality it chooses. And the only two realities it can choose, right? The only two contingent realities it's capable of creating are one that looks exactly like ours and one that is just empty, right? Like no contingent things exist at all. And that's it. So there's a metaphysically necessary random reality actualizer, and either it's going to produce an empty contingent reality, or it's going to produce a contingent reality that's just indistinguishable from ours, right? And it will do that basically just by flipping a coin, not actually flipping a coin, but randomly selecting between them with equal probability on each one, right? So if that's the case, or for this hypothesis, right, the likelihood of, you can take any set of evidence you like, any set of observations about the actual world that you might care to look at, and the likelihood of that evidence arising given this particular hypothesis is 0.5, right? And that likelihood is, sort of in the language of probability theory, the measure of the quality of this explanation. It's a measure of how well the hypothesis explains the evidence. And so that's one, but we can imagine another one where instead of flipping a coin, having a 50-50 choice between these two possible realities, it instead will pick the reality that's indistinguishable from ours 75% of the time. And now the likelihood of, our set of evidence based on that hypothesis is 0.75. And in fact, a unique random reality actualizer hypothesis exists for every real number between 0 and 1. There's a random reality actualizer that will actualize a reality indistinguishable from ours 99 times out of 100, 999 times out of 1,000, whatever, right? All of those exist in our space of possible cosmogenic hypotheses. So theism, right? Your maximally great being was not obligated to create a universe exactly like ours, a contingent reality exactly like ours. Theism doesn't entail perfectly, with perfect certainty, that a universe like ours would exist, which means that the likelihood of a universe like ours existing, given theism, is somewhere less than 1. It doesn't matter where, it's just less than 1, less than certain, right? And as long as it's less than 1, then there are an infinite number of these toy reality actualizers that provide a greater likelihood for the universe we live in than theism does. That's trivial. It doesn't even really have to be reached. It's a really trivial observation.
There are many possible cosmogenic hypotheses, and yeah, I would agree that it might be the case that God was not obligated to create this particular universe of ours that exactly is ours. But how would you answer the question? How can something come out of nothing? I guess when it comes to that question, most theists simply are come to the conclusion of a necessary being that has always been there. That and how would you sort of respond to that?
Well, I think if we're just talking about that as sort of a hypothetical objection to the argument that I've just summarized, it's just not right. In that argument, all of the alternative cosmogenic hypotheses I suggest include the existence of a necessary something that's always existed, right? Like all of these random reality actualizers are metaphysically necessary things. That, like, that's what the hypotheses say. So I'm not proposing any something out of nothing scenarios here. I'm proposing actually very straightforward analogs to theism, where contingent reality comes out of a non-contingent reality.
Okay, it's pretty interesting. Wow. So in a way, these like mindless, actual random reality actualizers are also sort of necessary beings, right? But it's simply the case that you're arguing against sort of a personal classical theist God with like with agency and the will and all that. But in a way, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're exactly right. This particular argument that I'm talking about here is not an argument against the idea that there is some metaphysically necessary cause of contingent reality. I'm not particularly interested in arguing against that idea. I don't think we have particularly good reasons to think that that's true, but ultimately I don't care. I don't care whether it's true. I'm more concerned about whether, classical theists have picked the best or the most likely metaphysically necessary cause, and it's clear that they haven't. It's clear that the particular metaphysically necessary hypothesis that they've pinned their hopes on is not just sort of a poor one in general. It's astronomically unlikely. Once we sort of account for everything, it's almost certainly not the right one.
Are you arguing for like these like mindless reality actualizers because you're sort of like criticizing the concept that classical theists make about the nature of this necessary being? Like you're saying, like, look, there are many possible attributes that this necessary being could have, or necessary something could have, and it doesn't have to be how you're.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. I think you've characterized that very well, actually. Yes.
Okay, so in that case, like for example, how if I've talked to many theists, and argue from like the Aristotelian, the Thomist approach of the actualities and potentialities, and when it comes to this, like, okay, you don't agree with Aristotle about actuality and potentiality, okay, but when it comes to like for like, how would I put it? Like what could be the the reason for something to act, like this necessary being to act on anything, and then this requires some sort of at least like an agency, that sources from this necessary being, right? And this agency has to also describe the being to be like the like pure being. I guess I don't know how to explain it, but I guess my question is like, do these mindless random reality actualizers at least like have a reason in and of themselves, like to start to begin anything?
Yeah, that's just fundamental to their nature. I mean, that's the hypothesis. The hypothesis is that there is a metaphysically necessary thing, and an essential feature of its nature is that it will select and actualize one contingent reality. That's what the hypothesis is.
Yeah, and this is really a good critique, bro. But when it comes to this, I don't think that all theists take the causality route. There are those presuppositionalists, and there are those like the religious epistemologists. So the route of classical theism isn't the only route that theists take, right? So at least like, how would you respond to those arguments? Like, do you at least like would you analyze them and then come to a conclusion for yourself. Oh, these arguments are not enough, are insufficient, or actually flawed, right? And yeah, you have sort of analyzed them.
So let's see. I've looked into presuppositionalism a bit, and it's interesting. So it's sort of a weird take on epistemic foundationalism. I don't really have any problems with epistemic foundationalism, but sort of the theistic presuppositionalists, it feels like they're taking sort of a legitimate notion, this epistemic foundationalism, and kind of bastardizing it. Like, I think if you look at epistemic foundationalists, there are a wide variety of ideas about what epistemic foundations might look like, and presuppositionalists go say, no, there's only one presupposition, there's only one epistemic foundation that functions, and it's theism. And that's just not true. Like, it's really trivially not true. There are lots of epistemic foundations that function just fine. And so the hard theistic presuppositionalism, sorry, can't say that word, just isn't true. It's not defensible, and it's silly. A soft theistic presuppositionalism might say, like, okay, yeah, there are lots of sort of possible epistemic foundations we might select, but theism is at least one of the ones that works. So, that gives us a justification for affirming it. And I'm not sure that's true, but also at the same time, it's very difficult to talk about justifications for affirming foundations of your epistemic system, right? That's sort of a fundamental problem. So if you want to say that you are a soft presuppositionalist, and that you have taken the existence of God as sort of the foundational, the foundation of your epistemic system, that's fine. That's fine. I'm not going to call you an idiot for doing that. It's not silly even, I don't think. But you're never going to be able to convince me that I have to do that, because I obviously don't. I can pick any number of other foundations. And also, you can't turn around and say that then you are rationally justified or epistemically justified in doing that, because again, we can't really meaningfully talk about epistemic justifications for our selection of epistemic foundations. So all you're doing really is, that's basically the same thing as saying that you just affirm theism by faith. And I don't have a problem with that. You can just choose to have faith that theism is true, but that's all that epistemic presuppositionalism is at its best. And as far as the other sort of category of arguments you mentioned, it wasn't a term that I was familiar with. It might be something where I've heard some of these arguments and just never associated them with that word. Or, I again, I'm not a genius of Christian apologetics. It's quite possible there's a whole branch of the topic out there that I've just never encountered. So if you want to float one of these past me in particular, I'd be happy to take a stab at it. But I don't have anything off the cuff. Nothing prepared for that.
Okay, so I guess yeah, being an atheist doesn't really obligate you to know all the theistic arguments and then have to analyze and critique them, in order to be an atheist, right? You just have to what does it mean to be an atheist? Basically, are you saying is it simply you're someone just being honest and with your intellectual integrity and is that looking at all the arguments for theism and just finding that all of them aren't really enough, right? Or at least the ones that you face aren't like actually leading to that conclusion.
Yeah, so I think, atheism means different things to different people in much the same way that theism does. It's not wildly different from theism in that regard. Theism means different things to different people. When I say that I am sort of a hard, confident atheist, I'm mostly referring to the fact that I am confident that classical theism is not true. And I recognize that there are lots of other sort of religious beliefs, lots of other, I call them demiurge hypotheses, these sort of cosmogenic hypotheses that involve intelligent creators. And I can't argue against all of those. I would like to. That would be neat. If I could figure out how to do it. If I ever figure out how to do it, I'll let you know. But I don't see any good broad spectrum argument against all demiurge hypotheses. So I am an atheist in that I'm confident that classical theism is false. And I am an atheist in that there are no sort of demiurge hypotheses that I affirm. And I have looked for reasons to affirm a variety of these hypotheses. I've been presented with a large number of things that other people consider reasons to affirm them, and all of those have failed. Yeah, have failed to sort of meet my epistemic standards. That's not to say that nobody will ever convince me again, but at some point you just kind of get bored of looking for new arguments for gods, because you look and what you see really, instead of finding new stuff, is the same stuff over and over and over again. And I just, at some point you get bored of like trying to sift through the chaff looking for novel gems that are worth talking about. And I hit that point a couple of years ago where I just didn't feel like it was worth my time to continue looking, because I had seen what I felt was quite a lot, and just all of it had failed. So that I'm sort of a soft atheist in that regard, and a harder atheist with respect to classical theism specifically, if that helps.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then. When it comes, I guess you've come to the conclusion. Okay, there is no God. But at least like a soft atheist to the demiurge, uh, you know, theories. But let's talk about so you're here. You're alive and you're living in this, human civilization with at least with living in a modern age, I guess. So, what I'm gonna ask you just one big question, like, what is the meaning of life, bro? Because when it comes to atheism, a lot of theists say like it entails like nihilism, right? And that there is no intrinsic meaning and everything. But how would you look at it? If there is no God, then what's the point? Why are we here? How should we behave? I guess it's a big question.
So I will say that atheism doesn't entail any sort of nihilism. This is a pretty strong claim that really cannot be defended. I think a lot of atheists tend towards nihilism or subjectivism, and I think that a lot of popular apologists tend to sort of conflate nihilism and subjectivism, even though they aren't really the same thing. And I guess for me personally, yeah, I'm sort of a meaning subjectivist. We as humans construct our own meanings, right? We construct our own reasons for living. We ascribe, I hope that's a real word, ascribe our own meanings to our lives, and that's really all the meaning that there is, just whatever we create for ourselves. And I find that to be pretty satisfactory, and I find it to be satisfactory because it's very clear that we do this, right? Like, nobody's out there saying that humans don't create meaning for themselves. So it's pretty modest in that regard, right? And the only immodest part is the part where I say there isn't any other meaning. There's just the meaning we create for ourselves. And, I guess I could be wrong about that, but there's no good reason. Again, people tend to want me to think that there is a grander meaning, some meaning that wasn't just constructed by humans, but they just can't present that in a way that makes it seem like an epistemically justified belief. I don't see the evidence for it. So there definitely is the meaning we construct for ourselves, and maybe there's some other meaning, but if there is, it doesn't seem like any of us have really figured out what it is. Certainly not with any like good confidence or solid epistemic approach. So that's where I'm at in terms of the grand meaning question.
Yeah. Okay. When it comes to the subjective meaning that we create for ourselves, can you describe the subjective meaning that you've created for yourself, and is there like like an axiom that you base it on? Like, for example, like human flourishing or any of that.
I don't know. I might in a Ponzier moment say that I'm interested in human flourishing or harm reduction, but that's an oversimplification. I think it's probably an oversimplification for everybody. We all have pretty complex value functions, complex internal value functions, and those value functions are routinely inconsistent. Mine certainly is in some places. I think everybody's probably is. So I don't know. I don't have like a grand story for you about the meaning I've created for myself about my own life. I'm not going to tell you that like I've decided to be here to maximize human flourishing, because that's not really true. I mostly just sit around and eat lunch. It's not a significant contribution to human flourishing. I think that the meaning we create for ourselves is mostly is sort of a cobbled together edifice of lots of smaller meanings, lots of smaller goals and smaller values that we apply, frankly, not all that well for the most part to our behavior. So I'm here to sort of like be comfortable and to try to make my wife comfortable, and I work for the Census Bureau, so I derive some small amount of meaning from my job. I put out these economic statistics that people use, and it's helpful to them, but it's a bunch of little things. It's not a big thing. I think our construction of meaning comes in the form of lots of little things.
I totally agree with that, actually. Like, yeah, like no one goes about and says like, okay, the meaning of my life is to like help to maximize happiness for all of human civilization. We're pretty selfish, I guess, fundamentally. Yeah.
Yeah, we're definitely focused on ourselves and our immediate families, and we might construct tribes or clubs or whatever, but this is how we function. Like, even if we'd like to imagine that we function differently, you just have to look at what people actually do, and that's how humans behave.
All right, but okay, so but at least like there is some thought process that you went through, like, okay, I'm here right now and this is what I'm going to do. So what is it that you're doing right now? Like, are you're just, just as you said, you're making yourself comfortable, making your wife happy and all that. So and then finding meaning in your job as well. But what is it that you're doing right now in life? And why are you, I guess, you know, continuing to breathe, to be alive, to stay happy?
Why do I not commit suicide? Is that what you're asking me? Why have I not
It is
committed
an
suicide?
option. I don't
know.
know. Maybe.
Sure, I mean, I could, I guess, if I wanted to. I just don't. I just don't want to. And I actually think that's sort of an important point. That as humans, we come with this ingrained ability. I'm going to jump briefly and make an analogy real quick. So there's this theory about linguistic acquisition. All humans acquire language through socialization with almost no exceptions, right? I don't think there are like any good recorded cases of a human who like was raised by other humans and didn't acquire language. It basically just doesn't happen. We have some feature of our brain and its job is to build a model of language like as you grow up. And I think that the same is true for values. This is my sort of hypothesis, my idea. I think that as humans, we build up sort of unconscious value models or value functions that are partly informed by genetics and partly informed by socialization. And that, when I go out to get like lunch, right? Or I go, you might think of like the classic ice cream example. I go to get ice cream and I select between a variety of ice cream flavors. There's no rational reason for me to pick chocolate over vanilla. I just have some, mental structure, some value function in my mind, in my brain, right, that prefers chocolate to vanilla. And I think this is broadly true. I think that we have pre-rational values. I don't think our values are informed or constructed by rationality. I think we just obtain values. So I don't want to kill myself because I don't. And that really is the root answer, right? I didn't reason myself into that. That's just how my value function is structured. And it's possible. I do think we apply reason to our value functions. Like I said earlier, I think these value functions are often not consistent, and I think we can identify those inconsistencies and we can manipulate our own value functions to some extent, or at least make conscious decisions in places where our value function maybe is not consistent with itself. But I would not say I've done that in the suicide example. I haven't sat down and reasoned my way to an answer on the suicide question. I just don't want to. There's no conflict in my value function. My value function is like, nope, just keep going. And that's what I do because that's it. That's the root level explanation in my view.
That's pretty, I guess, understandable. I get what you mean. Yeah. Okay. Well, Cale, it's been awesome talking to you, man, and I really enjoyed this conversation, man. And yeah, I do agree that as humans, it's sort of innate in us to just decide to live, and not maybe it's evolutionarily attained. I think that's how you would take it too, right?
No, obviously part of it is that, yeah. Though I think you can certainly imagine. You can imagine like a culture in which one of the cultural values is suicide. It would be a little weird, perhaps, and it might pose a threat to that culture's longevity. But you can certainly imagine a culture in which people obtain this notion that maybe they should commit suicide through socialization. I'm not going to point to any particular society. I don't really know. I just say it's just a thought experiment. You can imagine there being a social component to this, and it not being purely genetic. That was my only point. Yeah. But yeah, largely, I think, right, obviously, evolution tends to want us to survive, at least until we reproduce, not in any sort of agenty way, but in the colloquial way. And you'd certainly see animals whose evolution has guided them into committing suicide immediately after reproduction, right? Like that's actually not that uncommon, and it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. We don't do that, probably because we tend to transmit so much knowledge to our offspring, but that's just super speculative on my part. I'm not an evolutionary psychologist.
Well, Cale, thank you so much for the conversation, man. This has been awesome. Yeah, and thank you for letting me pick your brain.
Sure thing. Yeah, well, hopefully you got something of value out of that ramble. All right, well, I appreciate it. Thanks a bunch.
So that's the end of it. Thanks for tuning in, guys. This is your host, Elmo Ador Jr., and thank you for listening in. And please subscribe. Please follow us on Facebook. Please follow this. Please. Thanks.
University of Maryland Global Campus has more than 20 years' experience providing affordable online education to military service members and working adults. Offering low tuition, no-cost digital resources replacing most textbooks, scholarships for those who qualify, and more. Learn more at umgc.edu/podcast.
It takes a lot of ingredients to fix or build a car, like cooking, but without the frozen dinner easy way out. eBay Motors has 122 million parts. It's always the right fitment, so you can follow any recipe to a T. Whether it's a vintage Italian coupe that's classic like Grandma's meatballs, or a German luxury car that's as complicated as Oma's rouladen, to cook up something great in the garage, use the eBay Motors app or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.